Hey guys, Mark here, and as a tech reviewer, I test out a lot of different phones. Some are extremely expensive at over $1,000, and some are more budget-centric at around, $200 or $300. But never before have I bought a brand new smartphone that costs this cheap. This phone is the Umidigi A5 Pro, and it cost me around 120 bucks brand new from Amazon. There are a bunch of reasons why I wanted to try out this phone, the main one being just to get a feel of what you can buy in 2020 if you had a really tight budget. But beyond that, I think it's important as a tech reviewer to ground myself every once in a while and test out phones that maybe aren't the best, and in doing so, to regain the appreciation for the cool technology we find in today's top-tier smartphones. So to do that, I bought the Umidigi A5 Pro. I settled on this phone because it was one of, if not the cheapest smartphone on Amazon that looked like it belonged in this decade. There were cheaper phones out there made by companies like Blue and TrackPhone, but they all looked like phones that came from like 10 years ago. And I wanted a phone that at least looked like it costs more than it actually did. And on that front, it delivers. It's got a mostly bezel-less front display with a water drop notch for the front selfie camera and just a bit of a chin. The back is solid glass, the sides are aluminum, and overall it actually feels premium in the hands. It looks and feels much better than some of the cheaper phones from Samsung, like the A51 I reviewed a couple of months back. The physical fingerprint reader has made a reappearance on the back of this phone, and to my surprise, it was actually a lot faster and way more accurate than I expected. I haven't had this fingerprint reader fail yet, and it's kind of making me miss the physical readers on modern smartphones. Now, the design isn't perfect, like there's still some oddities here, like the black antenna lines on a silver aluminum frame, but it's mostly pretty darn good, especially for a phone in this price range. Even the buttons on the side are solid and clicky with nice tactile feedback. The phone also includes a headphone jack, which is nice, but what's right next to that headphone jack is, not so nice. Another relic from a bygone era makes a reappearance here, and this one is not welcome back in my household ever. Micro USB. Remember those old cables that only fit in one way and they were extremely fragile? Yeah, that one. The screen helps make up for it. Included in this $120 phone is a Full HD Plus 6.3-inch LCD display with only a small water drop notch and a small chin for bezels. It's certainly not the best screen. It's got a distinct magenta hue to it, and it doesn't get super bright, especially when outdoors, but it's sharp and it's pretty darn good for watching media content on. As long as you're making use of that lovely headphone jack and using headphones, because the single speaker on the bottom of this phone is absolutely awful. One thing that sort of gives it away that this is a cheap phone is where the status bar meets the top bezel. For some strange reason, there's very little padding between the top of the status bar and where the bezel is, so the time and battery life feels a little bit claustrophobic up at the top. I'm sure that could be fixed with software, but don't count on it, because that's another area where this phone comes across as a bit of a cheap phone. Out of the box, the phone runs Android 9, which is totally fine, but there are no new updates yet that updates it to 10, and judging by how much this phone costs, or how little rather, it may never actually get there. Still, at the very least, Android Pie introduced gestures, so you don't have to use the ugly navigation buttons that take up a lot of the screen. Then there's the cameras. Surprisingly, there are 3 included on this phone, along with a depth sensor. On the back, there's a 16 megapixel standard camera, an 8 megapixel ultra wide, and a 5 megapixel depth sensor, while on the front, there's a 16 megapixel selfie camera inside that water drop notch. Unsurprisingly, none of them are very good, and they can only shoot a maximum of 1080p 30 FPS video, but hey, at least you got options, right? I would personally rather have 1 good camera on the back of this phone instead of 3 bad ones, which is exactly what you get here. The cameras take forever to hunt for focus, dynamic range and sharpness is bad across the board, and the bokeh mode takes absolutely forever to process, and the results are just not that good anyway. And that takes us to performance, the Achilles heel of almost all budget phones, and yeah, that doesn't change here. The phone is powered by a MediaTek Helio P23 processor and 4 gigabytes of RAM, and includes a whopping 32 gigabytes of storage. That last part isn't a huge deal because it can be expanded via micro SD card, but the rest of it isn't great. Performance is sloppy at best with frequent hangups and slowdowns, but I mean, what did you expect? It's a sub $200 phone. It can still play back 1080p YouTube videos without any stutter, and it even has a little bit of horsepower for some games that aren't too graphically intensive. Admittedly, coming from flagship phones, it was frustrating to use this phone at times, and the fact that it's running an older version of Android did absolutely nothing to help that. But this phone does have one extremely good spec. It's got a 4200 milliamp hour battery. That's a pretty big battery even by modern standards, and because it has a weak CPU and a small amount of RAM, it means the battery life on this phone is actually excellent. Now, charging speed is not going to be a strong point because the micro USB cable can't pump power into it very quickly, and a big battery just means longer charge times. But when it's fully charged, it can easily go for at least 2 days without needing juice, and that's awesome, especially on a budget phone. I think it's cool that cheap phones like this exist, but in order to win me over, in order for me to actually give a recommendation for someone to buy a phone like this, the manufacturers that make these phones need to pivot and do something a little different. I understand that they want to make their phones attractive and appealing and look expensive, but in my personal opinion, that's not the way to do a budget phone. Hear me out. Every single penny you spend making this phone is important. So instead of spending it on making your phone look good on paper with, like, the sleek glass back and the aluminum frame and the triple camera setup and near bezel-less display on the front, how about you throw all of that in the trash and just give us the basics? Give us a cheap but durable phone that has one good camera instead of 3 bad ones. Give us a low-end CPU, but one that's actually usable and doesn't crap out every 12 seconds, and maybe spend a little bit more money on your devs to update the phone to the latest Android software. It won't look as pretty, but the end result will be a phone that's actually enjoyable to use, and I think that's way more important. If you have a very tight budget, I'd honestly recommend going after an old flagship phone over this guy. With $120 on the used market, you can get an iPhone 6s, which still supports the latest iOS 14 from Apple, or if you save for a bit longer, you could even get something like a used Samsung Note 8, which would be a far better Android experience than the one you'll get on this guy. So that's my review of the Umidigi A5 Pro. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to support my channel. And as always, have a great day. And that takes us to performance, the Achilles heel of almost all budgies. Budgies.